Half a century on, Martin Luther King's legacy more relevant than ever. 50 years after the assassination of the iconic civil rights leader, the latest Black Lives Matter rallies, a reminder of the mortal dangers African Americans still face. They still suffer from more poverty, more discrimination than the general population in the U.S. There are still white supremacists and a current U.S. president who sometimes sends them what critics call dog whistle messages. But conditions and attitudes have indisputably improved. How much, though, is a question we'll be putting to the panel. King's achievements include the successful campaign to pass the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts. Both continue to be tested in parts of the formerly segregated South. King's greatest legacy, though, the nonviolent struggle that he espoused. His name is cited when Palestinians ponder the best way to advance their cause, or among Africans who reflect on their own colonial and post-colonial struggles. And we often ask that question, what would he say, what would he do if he were alive today? And in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Martin Luther King's dream. With us, Curtis Young, professor of history and literature at the French School for Higher Studies, ESSEC. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Francois.
Also with us as well, Nita Wiggins, the author of Civil Rights Baby, My Story of Race, Sports, and Breaking Barriers in American Journalism.
Yes. Good evening.
Thanks for joining us. And as well, Cheryl Ann Bowen, artist, curator of the Museum Precious Cargo exhibit. And you hang your hat in the Paris suburb of Aubervilliers. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot dead by a white supremacist. The civil rights leader had come to Tennessee to support a sanitation workers' strike. The previous evening, the 39-year-old Nobel Peace Laureate, who'd been the subject of numerous death threats, spoke with what sounds a lot like premonition.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Curtis Young, those remarks were made unscripted. He'd made a surprise appearance at this rally. What do you make of those remarks?
Look, Martin Luther King, you know, a year before had given his speech at Riverside Church in New York against the Vietnamese War. He was dealing with large issues of questions of peace, questions of poverty, along with questions of segregation. He knew, and his life was he had been threatened. He knew that his life was in danger. So he made, it was a choice. Do I continue this or not? And his choice was to continue this, and he knew that he was putting his life in danger in that way. So it wasn't a matter, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And he had that sense, he had that feeling that his life was on the line.
1968, and as you say, it's going beyond just the civil rights movement there. Yeah. Vietnam, as you mentioned, with that speech the previous year, and also this fight against povertyism.
Yeah, it was, in fact, Vietnam was a turn to, the idea was to turn this war of imperialism into a war against poverty. There were three things that Martin Luther King was concerned about at that time. He was concerned about militarism. He was concerned about materialism, as well as segregation. So these were issues that embraced the whole effort of how do we continue this project of democracy. So it wasn't just about the question of integration, but it was a question of the larger project of democracy.
Nita Wiggins, you were with us when we had a show eulogizing Muhammad Ali after he died.
Yes.
He refused to go to Vietnam, and he said, "What have the Vietnamese done to the black men in America?"
Exactly.
Is what he said. Here, with Martin Luther King, it's more about universal values.
It's universal values, but let me go back to talk about the Vietnam War. Because when Dr. King spoke on April 4th, 1967, it was to advise young men to become conscientious objectors if they did not want to join the war effort. So, of course, we know Muhammad Ali refused to go on April 27th, 1967. But when Dr. King spoke in 1967, it also affected my father, Roosevelt Wiggins, who told me he was in the throes of making a decision about re-enlisting in the military, and he did not. So for many reasons, we can be thankful for the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, but for my family specifically, his conversation at Riverside Church changed the course of my family. So it is a universal story, but it is a very personal story for the Wiggins household.
So the momentum by 1968 against Vietnam had shifted. Here, though, getting back to what happened in 1968, it really is the feeling of an unfinished job, this war on poverty.
Well, of course the job is unfinished. At the time, Black Americans were living a secondary life, or we might even say a level in the third level instead of the primary opportunities and rights of citizenship. So 1968 was a time when Black Americans were very disappointed and disillusioned with what they thought they would experience, with what they thought they would receive in the way of opportunity in America.
Cheryl Ann Bolden, do you remember April 4th, 1968?
Yes, I remember a lot of sadness. There was anger, but a lot of sadness. I remember the feeling of we lost something really, really, really strong. And what are we going to do now? Even though I was young, because everybody was sad. Everybody was sad. Everyone was speaking about it. I remember this idea of feeling like, even though I was young, that I had a responsibility. Somehow I knew at that point that I needed to do something in my future to make things better. It was sort of like a responsibility, that people were so sad that I was young and there was a possibility that we have a future, that we had to do something positive in the future.
Not everybody had that reaction, of course, and on the night he dies, there are riots that erupt in many major cities in the U.S.
Because people are angry. This idea, of course, if you're angry, you're going to react. And so we don't want to be violent, but at a certain point, it's a boiling point where you get fed up. And so the only way to really express yourself, not only way, but one way, was to say, hey, we are angry, and we're letting the world know that we are angry about this. But there was another side, a more profound spiritual side, where people began to speak to each other about, okay, what are we going to do now? But it was important that the United States understood that we were angry. And unfortunately, I remember the riots. My father's the second Black fireman for the city of Newark, and I remember the riots in Newark. And that affected me. I remember the streets were burning. We were burning our communities because of the anger.
And Curtis Young, you were in Chicago where there were also riots.
Yeah, I remember. There were riots. People took to the streets. National Guard was called out. Tanks, that sort of thing.
What was your reaction at the time?
My reaction was, there were a lot of things going on, because this was at the same time. There was Martin Luther King, there was Malcolm X, there was the Black Panthers, there was the Southern, there was SNCC and Stokely Carmichael. There were all of these efforts to try to wake white America up to the idea that this abnormal behavior, because this idea of segregation, that's not normal. That this abnormal behavior that they were carrying out was not going to stand any longer. So it was going to be a full-out democracy by any means necessary. And so we had our nonviolent movement, we had riots, we had introspection. It's multidimensional. This is a multidimensional, because the project in itself, that is the project of slavery and then the project of Jim Crow, is an insane project.
Hang on. You make it sound like it's some kind of grand coalition, but there were deep differences, right, between those who espouse violence and non-violence.
Oh, yeah, of course. There always have been. I mean, look at the difference between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. We're both trying to get to the same place, but there are different ways of trying to get there.
Some black neighborhoods across the United States still bear the scars of the riots that followed King's death. In others, it's the memory of those riots that endures. Our Washington correspondent, Philip Crowther, filed this report.
Virginia Ali has seen how times have changed on U Street since 1968. She is the 84-year-old owner of Ben's Chili Bowl, a Washington institution that survived the riots.
When Dr. King was shot that night, and everybody was in tears and crying and very, very sad, then that sadness kind of turned into frustration, and the frustration into anger, and the uprising started. When the riots happened, you would have seen all of this stuff being broken down, broken into, and being robbed, and being just burning. It was just a sad time, a very sad time. Japan, nice. I love your food.
Ben's Chili Bowl has become much more than just a fast food joint. It was the only restaurant that was allowed to stay open during 3 nights of rioting.
And this provided a place for first responders, police officers, city officials, activists, everybody looking for a comfortable, a safe place and some comfort food and some coffee. This was the place.
Barack Obama and none other than Martin Luther King Jr. are among those who graced the booths here. Virginia Ali's restaurant is a slice of history.
Okay.
U Street was once known as the Black Broadway of Washington, D.C. But after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and the riots in 1968, decades of neglect followed. Recently, though, there has been urban renewal. Because of increasing rent prices, though, many African Americans had to leave this area. They are still proud, though, of what this part of the U.S. Capitol represents. Clenny Murphy grew up here and saw the riots up close. He still comes to Washington's now gentrified 14th Street to go to church every Sunday.
It was a riot zone. The term riot is really true. The demographics changed and everything. The church has shrank now to less than 300 members. Now, that's their acolytes.
Many of the churchgoers are of Clenny's age, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s generation. Their numbers are dwindling.
I think you would be highly disappointed, extremely disappointed, to have everything pretty much put in reverse.
Washington's 14th Street is now booming. A predominantly white and rich crowd now saunters down the blocks that were burning 50 years ago.
You know, Wiggins, your reaction to that report, Washington, which has known gentrification since then, and it sort of mirrors what we've seen in a lot of inner cities in the United States.
You mean the redevelopment, the return of investment, the return of energy and people? Yes, I lived in Memphis. I lived and worked in Memphis from 1995 to 1997. And that is a city that really has undergone redevelopment despite the economic problems that were leading to decay and people who were leaving the city.
And some of the people, the original residents of that neighborhood, a little bit bitter about it.
And they have to be bitter, and they should be bitter, because when there is investment, guess what? The person who owns a piece of property and has lived on a piece of property has to either make sure that that family invests its money to participate in the growth or has to move. So the gentrification is happening in too many places. I've seen it across the country. I've seen it in Memphis, in Charleston, South Carolina, you name it. The cities where the core of a black population had its base, those people have been displaced.
And in that half century, the economic lot of African Americans has improved by a lot. But the wage gap with whites has also grown. So is the glass half full or half empty?
I have to look at everything as half full, because I would hate to discount any gains in any way. But as we talk about wage gap, so many people talk about the difference between black and white employees and their wages. But we really have to look closer, and we say between black women and white men, or Asian women and white men, or black men and white men. And so we have many layers to evaluate when we look at the growth when we look at the progress of the black race economically.
Cheryl and Bolden, that church that we see in the report, it's got, he said they're down to 300 parishioners there. Why haven't white churchgoers replaced the black ones?
Well, part of the issue for me is this idea of people mixing together, okay? It's okay to not mix. I don't believe that we all have to mix together. For me, it's about respect, okay? There's a certain way that white folks praise God and black folks praise God. There's a different way. So I don't think it's necessary that we have to necessarily go to the same churches, but we have to respect each other. And the fact that neighborhoods are being destroyed, people are being kicked out of their communities. For example, Harlem. I mean, I'm from New Jersey, and I'm looking at my hometown of Newark. But the last time I was in Harlem, a lot of black folks are upset because white folks are moving in, and it's their attitude. It's not the fact that we can't live together, but they move in with an attitude that now I own this community. There's no communication between the two people. So I think there has to be, excuse me to say white folks, but white folks are Europeans too. They need to be able to understand what's going on in our heads, to really understand our history, to not just make assumptions that we don't necessarily want you in the neighborhood or we don't want to worship with you, but what's your attitude towards the black community? What are you going to bring to the community? Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And when you move to France, where things like a census form that states your race is something that's illegal, you would never do that here. What are your feelings when you look at the way the races mix or don't mix in the United States?
I think in France we need to start doing census, because if you talk about census, we're talking about in terms of this thing called affirmative action, which France, what do you say? What is it? Positive discrimination, which I think is strange. So it gives you, we were talking about the wage, it gives you an idea of where people are. I think that's important. I think to know who's working, is there a percentage of people of color in certain jobs? And that's not happening.
Because the French idea is that the state should be blind to...
but it's not blind. This is a problem here. And I think that France needs to come to grips with that. They're not blind, that's for sure.
All right, we're going to pick up on these points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. 50 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, we're having a look at his legacy with Curtis Young, professor of history and literature at ISEC, the business school. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Artist Cheryl Ann Bolden is with us, curator of the Museum Precious Cargo exhibit, and Nita Wiggins, author of Civil Rights Baby, My Story of Race, Sports, and Breaking Barriers in American Journalism. Welcome back to all of you. By the way, lots of reactions that have been coming in on the hashtag F2 We'll play you some of those perhaps. Here's one. On April 4th, 50 years ago, a sniper attempted to silence Dr. King's message. He failed. King may not be alive in the flesh, but his dream is alive more than ever. There's a long way to go before we get to the promised land, but we will undoubtedly make it. That from Austin. That's just one of the reactions we're getting on the hashtag F24 debate. Now, among those on the balcony in Memphis after King was shot, civil rights leader and former U.S. presidential candidate Jesse Jackson, who was asked how the next generation can fulfill his dream.
We can fight to stop the brutal violence. The march last week for life, ban assault weapons. We, as a nation, we are much too blessed to be so violent as a nation. We kill 30,000 Americans a year. We kill each other more than any other nation does. And they must have the rational sense to choose nonviolence and to go another way.
Nita Wiggins, this called, again, that goes beyond just race here, to that part of fulfilling Martin Luther King's dream is to go for what is obvious for somebody who espoused nonviolence, which is against guns.
Against guns, for sure. And you were asking the panel about memories on April 4th, 1968. I was 3 years old, 11 months, and I was watching television. And for me, that was hearing the announcement of Dr. King's assassination. It was the death announcement of the first person I loved outside of my family. And so gun violence for me has been personal since that day. My first media icon was taken through gun violence. And in the country, in the United States, we continue to allow guns to be sold, to be used, to be transferred. There has to be a solution. And I think we are not too far from getting one, because you asked about the glass, whether it's half full or half empty. For me, I have to maintain the idea of being having a half full glass. And gun violence is one of those, because this cuts so deeply. When someone is ripped from us, a loved one is ripped from us because of guns. So I think we are about to see something change, because we saw what happened in Florida, and the high school students have now been organizing, and they've made movements. They've moved the debate farther than it has moved in my lifetime. I don't know that the panelists would have the same view, but for me, I have more optimism about doing something to limit guns today than I've ever had in my lifetime.
I agree.
Yeah.
And that would be the call. He would be taking up that mantle, Martin Luther King, today.
Absolutely. I mean, look. The thing is, we keep cornering Martin Luther King in this world of civil rights for black people. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King was about expanding the project of democracy. It's all inclusive. So one of the legacies for me for Dr. King is that white people no longer think that it's normal to sick dogs on children and hose people. White people are beginning to realize that it's no longer normal to have segregated schools and segregated accommodations and this sort of thing. It's not about it. The progress is that white America is slowly but surely, thanks to people like Dr. Martin Luther King, waking up to the fact that their behavior with Jim Crow and that sort of thing is not normal. It's not a part of the human project, if you will. And so this to me is why we're beginning to open up to, we have to get rid of guns. We have to get rid of segregation. We have to get rid of, and at the same time that we're doing this, and you alluded to this in the beginning of the program, we have a political party in power now, and the president is trying to roll back the things that have been put in place since 1964, 1965.
See, a project that I talked about when I was with you back in 2016 is something called RRR, Race Relations Reconstruction. It's a project that I am launching. It is my initiative. And it starts very simply. It is just to listen. If you are white, listen to a black person. If you're a black person, listen to a white person. And with a new mindset, with new acceptance of other people's experiences, of other people's lifestyles, there can continue to be movement. Because the project of getting rid of guns, the project of developing more economic opportunities and more social justice, those projects start with understanding where we were, 12 generations of literal slavery, and 5 generations of freedom after emancipation. We have to listen to what other Americans need to say to each other so that there can be a joint solution.
All right, let's pick up on that point, because there is this notion that some people think things are going forward, some think they're going backwards. When it comes to the subject of love, they certainly seem to be going forward. The number of mixed marriages in the United States has risen steadily, up from 3% in Martin Luther King's day to 17%, according to a survey that was done last year by the Pew Research Institute. Perceptions also changing. Opposition to mixed marriages have dropped among blacks, among Hispanics, whites, Asians. If you look at those numbers, you'll see that they only surveyed in the past blacks. That's why you only see the African Americans listed at the beginning there. So that's the positive side. But when it comes to the listening part, social media, the new digital age, makes it easier to shut out the other side. On the one hand, you have those who embrace the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and on the other, you have what we saw with white supremacists able to drum up a lot of support in Virginia and have that rally which proved fatal last year.
Right. I think really it's about education. We have to educate people. We're still dealing with stereotypes.
But is intolerance growing?
But this thing of tolerance, this thing about tolerance, you can tolerate, but it's about respect. It's about love. It's real basic. This is what, for me, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about, was about love. So you don't have to, again, you don't have to like me, but you have to respect me and understand the history. The idea of having conversations with each other, even if I disagree with you, at least we can put the ideas on the table and speak about them. Mm-hmm. I think that's real important. In terms of interracial marriages, I mean, we're not dogs and cats. We're human beings. So people are falling in love. Now, going back to the Black Lives Matter, if I can say that, for example, just because it's called Black Lives Matter doesn't mean it's just for black people. Anytime people of color disagree or begin to enact something positive, it's considered subversive. This is an issue for me also, that everyone should join Black Lives Matter. It's a movement. It's a positive movement. So I think that white folks, not just Americans, but Europeans need to see that it's not against them. It's against a system. Something is wrong and we have to heal it.
To that point, let me just, it occurs to me, Martin Luther King received his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College.
In Atlanta.
And on the campus of Morehouse College now is the Gandhi King Ikeda Center of Peace, talking about Mahatma Gandhi, an Indian nonviolent resistance fighter, Daisaku Ikeda, a Japanese Buddhist educator and intellect, and Martin Luther King, an Indian, a Japanese, and Dr. King Center with a peace award. So this is about humanity. This is about humanity coming together. Again, as Cheryl says, it's not a question of black and white. We talk about, for example, white supremacy. That's an insane note. There's no such thing as a white supremacist. That people think that is part of our insanity. They're not supreme white people or black people or other kinds of people. There are people.
Dr. King called it the lie of black inferiority.
Voilà. There you have it.
Yeah.
If you live in France, you know that big cities like Toulouse, Rouen, Le Havre, Nice, as well as dozens of smaller towns, all boast Martin Luther King avenues, Martin Luther King streets, Martin Luther King squares. Let me ask you, Curtis Young, what would you say is Martin Luther King's legacy here in France?
Well, look,
why is his name on streets?
His names are on the streets, just as James Baldwin's name is on the lips of French people, just as Richard Wright, et cetera, because there's a long relationship between Black America and France. This goes back to definitively the First World War. It started even before then, but there's a long cultural, social, intellectual link between Black America and France. There's much to the consternation of white America over all of these years. So yes, there's of course a Martin Luther King Park there and school and et cetera, as there is a Rosa Parks stop on the tramway.
And also African Americans, I just was thinking about this in terms of our heritage. We are fighters. I mean, really, if you look at the history of African Americans, we have always fought. And I think that has a positive image in terms of naming schools and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But do they really understand what that means? It's not just one person. It's a movement. It's an idea. It's a love. It's a fight. The fact that you have to continue to fight. Just because people were saying, oh, we had a black president, So what? Oh, things should change because you had one man who's a president. He's not Jesus Christ. So it's also consciousness, but it's consciousness that's kind of blocked. It doesn't.
Yeah, and how do you explain that to French people, because they see Donald Trump as the guy who's rolling back all of Barack Obama's legacy?
Well, he's just a symbol. And it was after Obama, white folks got nervous. It was like, how can we have a black man run our country? It's an intelligent black man. I think that what happened is there is a backlash somehow. And again, white folks are afraid that somehow if people of color get more power, something's going to happen. They're going to blow up the world. So I really think that there is this kind of idea that you have understanding history. How did we get here? White people do not understand history. They need to really study history and understand why we are, what's going on today. And Trump is just a symbol.
But when we talk about taking over and when we're discussing Americans, we're talking economically. Because, as I say to my students, America is the capital of capitalism. Okay, this is clear. So, and that's
the big divide, right? Where King in his later life, and when he goes to support sanitation workers, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. As some people are perfectly happy to hear him talk about identity politics, less happy to hear him what sounds like, well, socialism.
Yes, but he was a union man. He came from a union mindset. He supported the working population, but in America, we have to talk about the history. We have to look at the real history, the economic history that built the country, the sweat of the enslaved people that built the country. And that is the part of history that makes white Americans nervous, because many white Americans owe their wealth to others who did not profit from their own work. And that is the great divide.
Still today.
Still today, of course.
Oh, my goodness. That's it.
It's not moving. And it starts with the economic divide, because we established that love is of any color. But when we have the economic motivation, that is when we have the push and pull, the violent push and pull.
And self-esteem.
Okay.
I think this idea of people of color feeling good about themselves, that you don't have to, this idea of being white, for example. I'm still hearing students talk about in the United States, if you speak a certain way, you're speaking white. Now, what does that mean? That's something really crazy. We have trauma in the community. So, yes, economics, but also swamim, this idea of feeling good about yourself and understanding that your history is not all bad. There's some really positive images in the history, and we have to direct ourselves to that. Help our young people learn about the history in a positive way so that we can take it on, assume a sense of self-love.
Curtis Young, when Martin Luther King wins the Nobel Peace Prize, he goes to Stockholm to Oslo, to accept the prize. Makes a speech in England where he defends the labor movement there. Did that make that winning of the Nobel Prize make him that universal figure?
No. He was already a universal figure. And there it is. Martin Luther King was looking at the human project. He was a humanist. He was looking at, for example, with his fight against the war in Vietnam, there were people in the Vietnamese who listened to Martin Luther King's discourse on that war, and that caused a situation where the Vietnamese, the soldiers in the field, had to grapple with how do we now deal with understanding that these soldiers that we're fighting from America are poor people just like we are. This is what we are learning from Martin Luther King. So this is the thing that troubled white America, is that Martin Luther King was identifying poverty. And the role that poverty plays in materialism and militarism, et cetera, and it was universal. So he was looking at the poor people in Vietnam and the poor people in America, who the industrialists have at each other's throats. And Martin Luther King was opening up the world's eyes to that. And I think this might have been one of the things that got that bullet put into and to raise rifles.
But the white American power structure has a problem with peace lovers because that affects the profit.
Exactly.
That affects the profit line. And so America has to have people of color fighting in the wars. And when a prophet comes and speaks against war, it causes a problem for the white money-making institutions. It goes back to the Double V campaign during the earlier wars, the World War II. Because when somebody speaks against sending your sons and daughters of color to carry a weapon to attack another country or to kill other people to profit the white institutions, the black families say, well, what do I get out of it? I can't even live with my full citizenship rights in my country. So to me, it still goes to that economic issue.
And
that helped Dr. King move toward the end of his life to speak against that in 1967.
And this issue of the capitalism, for example, we didn't profit as much as we should have from capitalism. So the idea that he was speaking in terms of socialism, for example, I went to school in China in 1980 because I was interested in a different system. The fact that the Chinese closed themselves off, look at how strong they are now. So there's a whole question of...
And the idea of a universal salary. Dr. King was a progressive who spoke of that.
One final point on this. This week, people are mourning in South Africa the death of Winnie Mandela. Now, she is a divisive figure, even within the ANC, because she at times espoused killing for traitors within the movement. And it's a reminder that the ANC was not always it was not always a nonviolent struggle. They took up weapons at times. And so when you look at that grappling with the past of whether or not it's best to fight with violent means or nonviolent means, what are your thoughts when you look now, today, 50 years on, at Martin Luther King? Because some people will answer to you in all struggles around the world, nonviolence doesn't always do it.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. When you look at the black radical tradition that goes all the way back to when we came from Gory Island, it's been resilience. It has not been a violent struggle. And when there were slave uprisings and this sort of thing.
You're talking about the U.S.
I'm talking about the U.S. When there were slave uprisings, this sort of thing, the majority of the people that were killed would be black people, not white people. Our black radical tradition has been a tradition of resilience to fight against this with our hearts. Now, at the same time, there are some, because we live in a context of violence. I mean, we 30 years war, 100 years religious war, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, what's going on right now in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. We live in a very violent world. I think it's very interesting how we isolate when there's black violence. We point to that within a context of overall violence. So, ANC was a struggle against apartheid. That was condemned by the Americans. That was considered to be a Marxist organization, a terrorist organization, in fact. Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by the Americans.
By the white Americans?
Yeah, exactly, by white America.
Certain white Americans.
And certain white Americans. And so there you cannot say say violence, nonviolence. There are people who have a propensity towards violence. There are people who have a propensity towards violence. One last thing. There's no surprise that at the end of World War I, white America bombed Tulsa, the black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
And we don't discuss that in the school books. Imagine.
Yeah.
Well, I do.
Well, you're welcome back to discuss this further. I want to thank Curtis Young, Cheryl Ann Bolden, Nita Wiggins. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
How is the conversation evolving in the U.S. on this 50th anniversary of King's assassination?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Certainly it's definitely, without question, a time for reflection, because it comes at a moment in the US where there is still so much inequality, so much police brutality, where people have to be reminded that Black Lives Matter. Now, the New York Daily News has come up with a front page that I think many people are asking themselves today, 50 years later, what would he think? Now, behind that very recognisable silhouette are the faces of many people who have died as a result of police brutality in the US. Some of the Trayvon Martin as well, of course, not a case of police brutality, but somebody who never saw justice in the event of his murder, his killer walking free. And the New York Daily News really, I think, very much hitting the nail on the head. They've chosen the quote, "We have come here today to dramatise a shameful condition." And it does feel as though, certainly reporting on the events in the US, that there is something to be ashamed about right now. The New York Daily News also highlighting this particular quote, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." And undoubtedly that's a big talking point online at the moment. There are, of course, lots of eulogies as well. The Atlantic is well worth a look. They've done a special digital and print version of their magazine, specifically called King, and it is full of many interesting articles. One that I think you have to read, really, if you're only going to pick one, written by his youngest daughter, Bernice. She was just 5 years old when he was assassinated. And what is interesting is that this is one of the few articles, really, where you get a sense of optimism. She seems to have inherited so much of her father. They describe her here as a mediator, orator and minister. She's, of course, the CEO of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Non-Violent Social Change as well. And what she talks about in this article is we cannot afford to regard as normal the presence of injustice, inhumanity and violence. And she brings it bang up to date by talking about verbal and cyber manifestations, because, of course, there's so much bullying that goes on online today. Really hateful stuff that, unfortunately, in my job, I have to trawl through a lot of it. And it can be really deeply shocking to find some people hold these views. The Guardian newspaper has a very interesting article as well. This is quite a long read, but it's well worth taking a look at. And it basically looks at really what happened to Martin Luther King's legacy. They say here how a rebel leader was lost to history. And lots of people using the word airbrushed or whitewashed in order to make what he said fit a sort of a more white narrative, if you like. Gary Young has written this piece, and he talks about the fact that he knows the US will go into an orgy of self-congratulations, selectively misrepresenting King's life and work to mark this 50th anniversary. And he goes on to say that basically what many are doing is omitting the fact that he was on his way to becoming a pariah when he was killed. And what he lists here are various articles written in the days before Martin Luther King's death, which gives you an idea of how he was viewed at that moment in time. The New York Times talking about a protest that turned violent, saying the events were a powerful embarrassment to him. The Providence Sunday Journal calling him reckless and irresponsible, and most powerfully, a column in the Dallas Morning News which called King the headline-hunting high priest of non-violent violence, whose roadshow in Memphis was like a torchbearer sprinting into a powder house. Now, when you see quotes like that, you realise just how much the narrative has changed and how differently people look upon him today. And it's also worth remembering that, actions that were looked at negatively then, what are we doing the same with right now? What actions are we seeing as maybe negative and that we should be taking a step back and reflecting on? So that's a really, really interesting read. This in the Miami Herald, too, talks about killing the myth of Martin Luther King, as in some way he feels that people believe that Martin Luther King actually ended racism, which, of course, he didn't in any way, shape or form, sadly. This writer says you have to remember that he was provocative, radical and progressive. And really, it calls people to actually look at the incidents like Colin Kaepernick, the American footballer who chose to take a knee to protest police violence as the national anthem was being played. And even now, 50 years after Martin Luther King, that act of non-violent protest is seen by so many as unacceptable.
Yeah, many thanks for that, Emma James. We'll have more, of course, on our website. I want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.